Rostabash is a senior fellow for the Center for Policy Research. The bios for everyone are in your notes, and I don't want to embarrass them by reading out all of their achievements, so please, Navras.
Thank you very much, Philip. My job is to take you through this middle part of the afternoon as smoothly as possible. And the first part of that task is to introduce Professor Brahma Chelani, who's going to speak to us about environmental health and humanitarian issues. So I think just to take a few seconds, Brahma Chelani is worthy of a few minutes of introduction. So he is a professor of strategic studies at the Center of Policy Research in New Delhi. He's held appointments at a range of academic institutions, including Harvard, the Brookings Institution, and so on. Is the author of a number of books and is a well-noted public intellectual in India on these issues, including as a member of the National Security Advisory Board of India in the past. So we are very fortunate to have him here with us. We have him for a relatively brief time, so we're going to structure this as a set of comments from Professor Chelani, and then as many questions as we can manage until he has to leave at 2 o'clock. So with that very brief introduction, let me invite you up to the stage, sir.
Thank you, Navroz, for that introduction. I doubt whether I am the right speaker to kick off the session right after lunch, because an ideal speaker in the post-lunch session is one who can tell jokes and keep an audience in good humor and awake. I'm afraid the organizers chose the wrong keynote speaker, because this is a heavy subject, a subject in which there isn't much good news and very little good humor. What I intend to do in the 25 minutes that I have is to give you the big picture on the issues and challenges relating to environmental health in the context of the growing human impacts on the natural environment. The natural environment is critical to our health. Not just physical health, but also social and psychological health. WHO defines health as not merely the absence of disease or infirmity, but as a state of complete well-being, physical, social, and psychological. Environmental health is so closely tied to the natural environment that, for example, as you know, contaminated water can cause cholera, air pollution can cause respiratory diseases, and heavy metals can cause neurotoxicity, while climate change threatens to introduce new pests and new pathogens. A sound natural environment, on the other hand, can significantly contribute to public health. For example, the concept that plants and flowers have a role in mental health is beyond dispute. There was a study published way back in 1984 in the journal Science that found that post-operative patients in hospitals with rooms overlooking trees needed less pain medication and less hospitalization than post-operative patients that looked out at brick walls. The fact that many pharmaceuticals derived from plants and animals underscores the imperative for preserving biodiversity and safeguarding our natural ecosystems. Unfortunately, unprecedented pressure is being placed on natural resources and ecosystems to meet the fast-growing demands of our economies and populations. This is resulting in soil, air, and water pollution, growth of greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, introduction of non-native species, and other unsustainable practices. That in turn carries major impacts, direct or indirect, on our climate, ecosystems, biodiversity, and public health. For the sake of illustration, let's consider just one resource, water, because it's the most critical of all resources. Persons can live without love, but not without water, right? Can there be public health without access to clean water? Water-related diseases alone cause about 3.4 million deaths a year. Water is a renewable resource, but it's a finite resource. If you wonder how a renewable resource can be a finite resource, the answer lies in the fact that nature has a fixed replenishment capacity to renew water. That capacity of nature has remained the same since the dawn of human civilization. Every year, nature can renew up to 43,000 billion cubic meters of water. Today, water is the world's most underappreciated, undervalued, and underpriced resource, whose reckless exploitation and growing shortages carry major long-term implications for public health. The larger reality is this: humanity is changing the Earth's ecosystems more rapidly than its own scientific understanding of the implications of change. Human impacts on the environment are threatening human health and human security. The overuse of water, land, energy, minerals, and biological resources is also contributing to climate change. Climate change is more than just about greenhouse gas emissions. After the remarkable improvements in infant mortality and life expectancy in the last 100 years, the continuing human alterations of ecosystems are threatening to raise morbidity and mortality rates. The spread of antibiotic-resistant bacteria is one example of the human impacts on the natural environment. I was looking at the agenda, and in the morning sessions here, we were discussing critical issues like the continued rise of antimicrobial resistance and the rise of drug-resistant TB. These are some of the issues that underscore the already grave public health challenges. A few weeks ago, US intelligence released a public report on global security threats. That report identifies avian flu and Middle East respiratory syndrome, COV, as carrying global pandemic potential. The point is this: the future of human civilization hinges on sustainable development. Today, the growing gap between near-term development objectives and long-term human aspirations means that the costs of development are being passed on to future generations. It's important to note that although human civilization is thousands of years old, for example, the Indian and Chinese civilizations are almost 5,000 years old, the greatest damage to ecosystems, much of the damage, has been caused just in the last 100 years. The 20th century brought the most rapid progress, but also the most rapid damage to the Earth and its ecosystems. In the 20th century alone, humans altered or degraded up to 50% of the Earth's land, modified the natural flows of 2/3 of all rivers, and made extinct 1/4 of all bird species and many large mammal species. All that happened in the 20th century. According to the UN agency, UN Water, we have lost at least half of our wetlands. And since the mid-1970s, that is in the last 4 decades alone, aquatic ecosystems have lost more than 50% of their biodiversity. The world is still losing species almost daily, with serious implications for our search for new biologically active compounds for medicine. Even large herbivores like hippos, rhinos, and elephants are beginning to vanish from our world at a startling rate, even though as vegetarians, they mean no harm to other species. In fact, they are crucial to our ecosystems. Many of you know about a class of drugs known as ACE inhibitors. That class of drugs emerged from research on a Brazilian viper, a snake, a pit viper, whose venom was such that the victim's blood pressure would drop to 0. Years of research on this viper helped unlock the secret of how to regulate blood pressure. That in turn led to the development of this blood pressure group of drugs known as ACE inhibitors. Today, that viper has become extinct. What factors are contributing to the growing human impacts on the natural environment? Since 1960, the human population has more than doubled, but the global economy has expanded 11-fold. This would suggest that economic growth, more than demographic growth, is driving environmental stresses. In reality, the #1 culprit is consumption growth. The average human being is consuming more natural resources in the form of industrial and agricultural products. Yesterday's luxuries are becoming today's necessities. Even as the vast majority of nations have significantly reduced their birth rates, they've become more consumptive. In fact, declining fertility rates usually correspond with greater prosperity and greater consumption. Add to the picture the increasing BMI, body mass index of humans. The average BMI of humans has been increasing sharply in the period since the end of World War II. With the result, as a study in the journal Lancet shows, 30% of the people in the world today are obese or overweight. 30%. The rapid spread of obesity, even as hunger persists, typifies the extremes in our world, doesn't it? Let's consider the environmental impacts of the increasing BMI. Heavier citizens, as a rule, have heavier demands on natural resources. They also cause much greater greenhouse gas emissions because of their greater transport and food needs. An interesting study was published in the British journal, BMC Public Health. The study has found that if the rest of the world had the same average BMI as the United States, it would be equivalent to adding almost an extra billion people to the world's population, an extra billion people. So the issue is not just about how many mouths they are to feed. The issue is also about how much excess body fat there is on our planet. I don't have a global figure, but according to AMA, the American Medical Association, the yearly cost of treating obesity-related illnesses in the United States has crossed $200 billion. Against this grim background, global warming injects more ominous implications for our future, especially for public health. Climate science is a young science. It's a science still maturing. Not surprisingly, there are some gaps in our scientific understanding of the phenomenon of global warming. Still, whatever is well established scientifically on global warming suggests that the implications for public health in particular are going to be grave. Even in the most conservative of scenarios, the effects of global warming will create major new healthcare stresses. The health impacts will be greater on the poor, the elderly, children, and those with already underlying health conditions. In the panel discussion that follows, I'm sure you're going to hear some discussion on climate change mitigation and how, through adaptation, some of the impacts on public health could potentially be mitigated. But let me wrap up my presentation. The correlation between a healthy environment and a healthy body underscores the critical importance of environmental protection. It's often said, health is wealth. Health is wealth, wealth in a financial sense. In truth, health is inextricably linked with nature's wealth. I was looking at the agenda and the session just before lunch. You were discussing infectious diseases. That's a critical issue because many of the new and emerging infectious diseases affecting humans are originating in animals. This is leading scientists to investigate what is known as the ecology of disease. The ecology of disease arising from human impacts on the natural environment. One critical but overlooked factor behind the ecology of disease is the changing human diet. Humans have changed not only their diet, but they've also changed the diet of animals that they raise for their own food. Firstly, rising incomes in the last 6 decades have led to a major shift in eating habits, fostering increasingly meaty diets. If you look at the European diet today, compare it with the European diet 100 years ago, you will notice a fundamental shift in eating habits. If you look at Asian diets, they have changed almost in one generation. The Chinese diet today, which is heavy in animal protein content, bears no resemblance to the Chinese diet of the early 1980s. So in a matter of few decades, diets have changed fundamentally. Why is this important for our environment? Livestock require much more food, energy, water, land to raise and transport than plants. So the fast increasing international demand for meat depletes natural resources, damages ecosystems, and fuels climate change. This is the single biggest driver of environmental stress. Because meat production is an indirect way of generating food, it takes up to 30 crop calories to produce just 1 meat calorie. The livestock industry is also responsible for nearly 1/5 of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, the diet of industrially raised cattle has been deliberately changed so that livestock speedily gain weight through grain feed rather than through the natural grass feed. This development, coupled with the routine administration of growth-promoting hormones and antibiotics to healthy animals, carries major environmental, animal health, and human health impacts. Unfortunately, the administration of antibiotics to livestock prophylactically also raises the risk of microbes evolving resistance and spreading eventually to humans. I mentioned this US intelligence report released a few weeks ago. It says one of the greatest threats the world faces is potentially from a novel or re-emerging microbe that is easily transmissible between humans and can kill millions. In this light, one question that we need to ask ourselves is whether governments and civil society groups ought to play a role in encouraging citizens to eat a healthy, balanced diet for the sake of their health and for the sake of our planet. After all, don't governments use laws and regulations to discourage smoking on public health grounds? The WHO's classification a year and a half ago of processed meat as carcinogenic to humans and red meat as probably carcinogenic should serve as a wake-up call. The changing human diet is just one illustration. The world needs sustainability on all fronts, including energy, economic development, and resource consumption. And this is my last point. This demands defining development more broadly than just GDP growth. Right now, we are focused on GDP growth as the principal index of development. The benchmarks of true development ought to include protection of the physical and biological environments, resource conservation, public health, social equity, narrow income disparity, and environmental sustainability. The world, unfortunately, has made the mistake of overemphasizing GDP growth, which entails more and more consumption. Moreover, environmental impact assessments of proposed projects often do not examine potential impacts on public health. Why? Because the term environmental impact is defined a bit too narrowly. We need to correct that by redefining even that term. The key point is this: there can be no sustainability in our world without a more integrated and holistic approach to development. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chani. May I ask you if you would stay up here for a minute or two, maybe to take a couple of questions? Sure. I know your time is scarce, but let's see. Well, maybe I'll just speak loudly. Thank you very much, all too brief 20-25 minutes. But let me open the floor to questions if there are any, either clarificatory questions or if somebody wants to explore some points in depth. Thanks. Well, maybe if there isn't anybody right off the bat, let me maybe pose you a question if I could. I thought you very nicely sort of took us through the arc of sustainable development as a civilizational issue, to the kinds of stresses that we currently face, including species extinction, through to an emphasis on consumption, climate change as a forcer, and then to metrics, which is actually a nice bridge to the next part of the session. What I wanted to ask you, though, is you didn't really have time to get into this, but what do you see as the drivers of these changes? Is the driver really a lack of knowledge of the sorts of pernicious effects you talked about, which would then suggest that it's really about propagating knowledge? Or do we know that we are in this mess, and therefore it's about, despite knowing, there are forces that are constraining us and keeping us locked into these patterns? So to sort of pose it a little starkly as a choice, but perhaps you could take it whichever direction you think makes most sense.
Well, that's a good question, but if I answer that, it'll take me...
Yeah, just give us an indication.
That's a presentation by itself,
it
actually.
Is.
I'll just be telegraphic. First, humans are driven by near-term objectives, unfortunately. We have seen that in all spheres. And unless a real crisis looms, or a real crisis hits a community, a society, a nation, we don't wake up to the damage that we're inflicting on an ecosystem or a particular river or mountain or whatever it is. For example, in Europe, in the late 1980s, there was this famous chemical spill by a pharma company in Switzerland. It led to the Rhine River turning red. That served as a wake-up call for Europe to focus on water quality. Until then, the water issues in Europe related to navigation. Historically, from the 19th century, navigation was the real issue. How to make rivers navigable, how to promote trade on the rivers. But water quality was not an issue until the chemical spill happened in Basel. So right now, people think that we still have time and that the crisis is not really before us. Unfortunately, this kind of a short-sighted approach leads to continuing damage to the environment. And we should not forget that humans are a rapacious species. I spoke about how we have made so many species extinct. I don't think any species in the world is responsible for driving so many other species to extinction as humans. So we are an unusual species, and we think short-term.
Thank you very much. I know you have to, unfortunately, go to another appointment, but thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Please, round of applause. Okay, I think we will move on to the second part of the early afternoon's talk, and I believe we have to deal with some technical issues here. We have two speakers, one of whom is with us on Skype. So can we confirm that Professor Adil Najam is on Skype? Yes? Okay. So can I first then invite the first of our two speakers to come to join me up here. This is Jyotsna Puri, who we're very glad to have with us today. So Jyotsna, or Jo as she is known by many of us, is currently the head of the Independent Evaluation Office of the Green Climate Fund, which is the body that is dedicated to financing climate mitigation and adaptation actions globally. She has worked in this field of evaluation for a number of years and has also had academic appointments, including with Columbia University, the World Bank, and the UN. So we're very happy to have Jo with us to really try and tell us a little bit more about how you can think about both climate change, humanitarian assistance, and so on through a more focused, evidence-based approach. So I'm just going to hand this over to Jo in a minute for her presentation, but I'm also going to briefly introduce the second speaker just to keep us moving along, who will be with us on Skype. And our second speaker is Professor Adil Najam, who is the Dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, and also a Professor of International Relations and of Earth and the Environment. Adil was previously the Vice Chancellor of the Lahore University of Management Studies, LUMS, in Pakistan, and is widely written and widely read on issues of global public policy, climate change, South Asia, social and human development. So we're very happy to have these two extremely eminent speakers. So let me hand it over to Jo for about 10 minutes. And then turn to Adil, and then we'll try and keep as much time as we can for conversation. And this time I really hope to have questions, otherwise I'll pick on people at random from the audience to elicit conversation. So please be prepared with some questions. Jo?
Thanks so much, Navroz. Thank you. So I'm deeply cognizant that in this afternoon graveyard session, I'm also speaking to an audience that is already converted to a position that I'm going to encourage you to think about a little bit more. What you've been listening to in the morning is extremely good and fantastic field level research on areas that are quite important to MSF clearly. And I have to say that I haven't seen too many examples of these sorts of this sort of field level research by a whole lot of other humanitarian organizations. Having said that, when I was invited to this day today, I also thought that it would be useful for us to think about, well, what are we learning from advocating for evidence in the humanitarian action space that we can then translate to and take to the climate change space. So I'm going to talk a little bit about evidence, I'm going to talk a little bit about ease, and I'm going to talk a little bit about ethics, because I have only 10 minutes. And then I'm going to, and it'll basically be then up to you. Okay, so the title is, Why Don't We Know More About Effective Action, the Need for High Quality Evaluations and Evidence. Thank you very much for having me here, MSF. First is a quick story of bias. Yeah, so you all know about the earthquake in Pakistan in 2005. This is, the Earthquake Reconstruction and Rehabilitation Authority was basically asked and provided support by the World Bank to build back better. That was the big clarion call. Post that, ERA decided to do an impact assessment to understand whether they were actually building back better, and as a consequence of that, in 2008 is actually when the data collection for that study started. They did what's called a pre-post assessment. And a pre-post assessment essentially consisted of data being collected on 1,350 households in the earthquake-affected areas. There were 9 districts. In 2008, the baseline data was reconstructed in 2008. The post data, the end-line data, was collected in 2009. And in 2008, predictably, people were asked about their condition pre-earthquake. And so the difference was computed as the difference that the reconstruction effort had made to building back better. Clearly, there's so many problems with that sort of analysis, and I'm preaching to the converted here. Because it was unanticipated, you were looking for recall data. Recall data has a lot of problems with it. You were also constrained by selection bias. You were basically asking people who were in the affected area but still there 3.5 years later as to how they'd been affected. And you were completely ignoring households that had migrated out, or you were ignoring households that had essentially perished as a consequence of early recovery efforts not having been directed in an urgent enough manner. That then induces, respectively, either an underestimate of the total effectiveness of this effort or an overestimate of the effectiveness of this effort. Essentially, it's a biased estimate. There's also information bias. Yeah? People respond in recall surveys depending on what they think is the big incentive behind the recall survey. Essentially, because of this, what you have is a lot of confounding and really, really unclear information or evidence about whether this was actually building back better. And so really the takeaway point for me was when we started to look at this, and so my co-authors and I ended up writing a paper on how you have to think much more about effective implementation and scientific ways to assess implementation and delivery on the ground, rather than just thinking about what is good laboratory-based diagnosis or provision of medicine. Okay, so given all of that, we also did look at what the evidence base is in humanitarian action as well as in climate change. And again, you know this figure better than I do, but in the space of 2004 and 2015, the duration over which we did this study, we found that although more than $100 billion had been spent on humanitarian action, there were less than 50 studies that we could call high quality that actually assessed the effectiveness of humanitarian assistance. Yeah? And a lot of them were low quality. They did not have adequate sample size, had lots of sources of bias, did not have good theories of change, et cetera, and I can have a bilateral conversation with you about it. We also looked at evidence gaps for both humanitarian action and climate change separately, and this was work that I did when I was with the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, or 3IE. And this is what an evidence gap map looks like. So just to give you a quick idea, along the horizontal axis on the top are outputs or outcomes or impact variables. But along the vertical axis are essentially intervention categories. And what you want to do is, in that matrix, try and understand what is the concentration of high quality evidence that you can find and essentially populate it. And the different colors are showing you the quality of that evidence. So blue, red, and yellow show you the quality of that evidence. The evidence itself, the squares and the colored squares themselves don't tell you what direction this evidence is pointing towards. So it's not saying, yes, this is good or bad. All it's saying is, this is the quality of evidence that you have for this action and this outcome. What we found was that there was very, very little good quality evidence, especially in humanitarian action. Most of it was really to look at health, nutrition, and peace building. And when we looked at the same questions for climate change, both adaptation and mitigation, we found that there were very, very few studies that looked at programs that were aiming to improve livelihoods and also measuring the effect on greenhouse gases. Are we okay for time? Okay, so very quickly then, we acknowledge, I think, that if you want to do evaluations, slightly different from scientific research, of action in this space, there are huge challenges: need for speed, lack of preparation, there's a multiplicity of actors, high covariability, so it's very hard to find comparison or control groups. There's the ethics of it, and we can talk about that. And last but not least, you have absent or imperfect data. But I'm going to argue that it's really important to do this kind of implementation research, not just for the first order questions that we are interested in understanding, which is it effective or not, but also to understand the implementation science behind it. Now, what amount of assistance, how much, what frequency, to whom? All of these questions become really important if you really want to make sure that your action is effective. So we've worked in a whole lot of spaces, and in my earlier life and incarnation, I worked with 3IE. We created an entire portfolio of studies that we collaborated with UN-OCHA, with ACF, and quite a few others in the countries that I've listed. And the four big, quick takeaway points are, thank you, use other sources of data, use state-of-the-art methods. It's not as costly as you think. And good evidence can be transformational. So Navroz, I'm going to take 4 minutes.
I think you can go ahead and explain.
Yes, I'm going to. Thank you. So 1 minute per slide. Okay. So the first one, use other data. When we looked at this, and we looked at it at a lot of detail, in the case of Pakistan, it was easy to see, and the researchers recognized very quickly that what they could have looked at is the PLSMS, the Pakistan Living Standard Measurement Survey that had been collected actually in 2005. But you could have also collected data on distance from the epicenter of the earthquake, which can act as what's called an instrument for the intensity of the disaster that had been caused. Using that, you can then employ instrumental design techniques to understand the effectiveness of action. In other cases, we've argued as well that you know, for example, what the likelihood of disasters is, of earthquakes, of water crisis. Knowing this gives us then some amount of predictability. You don't know when a disaster or an event is going to occur, but you do know that it is going to occur. And so creating databases in this space becomes almost ethically irresponsible for you to not build them and to not look at their quality. The second is use state-of-the-art methods, okay? So again, in DRC, we worked with UNOCHA to then understand as to whether UNICEF action on reducing the vulnerability of affected populations was proving to be effective or not. And there, we used a technique called regression discontinuity in Chad to understand whether RUSF, ready-to-use supplementary food, was being effective for nutrition, but in the implementation program. The team there then collaborated with the team from Belgium to use a factorial design. Again, you don't need a lot of preparation, but you do need engagement right at the beginning for all of this to occur. And I can give you lots of examples. In Pakistan, we've used propensity score matching, and in Bangladesh, to look at a WFP program for cash transfers for refugees. The researchers employed a very nice natural experiment to understand if giving cash transfers was working or not, and they took advantage of the fact that WFP had stopped, the government had stopped registering refugees or made them ineligible after a certain point in time. So, and then my last example was in Philippines, where again you can use, in the case of the typhoon there, the researchers thought about using instrumental variables and wind speeds to understand the devastation caused by the typhoon. The third example, clear message is that all of this is not as costly as we think, because that's one of the biggest obstacles to employing good quality methods to understand implementation research and to understand effectiveness of action. We did a simulation of this in Sri Lanka to then understand whether a multitude of agencies were making a difference or not. And we found that you actually required a very, very small sample size, about 100 children, to get very, very good results at 95% level of confidence, so that the initial ideas about what was completely prohibitive were completely belied. So small data collection, not as costly as you would think, and the time, depending on how early you've engaged, you can actually reduce it to 6 months. And my last is evidence can be transformational. In the case of humanitarian action, the big question that WFP decided to look at was, well, a group of researchers in the Johns Hopkins decided to look at was, well, what is working and what is not? Is it cash transfers? Is it food transfers, or is it in-kind transfers? And they basically compared all of these and found, and they combined 100 studies in a very nice systematic review. And they found that yes, cash works. What was interesting for me, and really the epilogue of this entire story, is that WFP decided on the basis of this evidence that 25% of their programming would be devoted to cash, which was really important and useful to know. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Jyotsna. I think we're now going to take a leap of faith here and project Adil Najam up on the screen. Yeah, so if you could pop him up on the screen. Adil, can you say something so we know that you're live? There we are. Good. Very good. So we have Adil Najam up on the screen, and what we have so far this morning is sort of a very nice tour of the landscape from Professor Pramachelani. A very nice tour of the landscape from Professor Pramachelani. A very nice tour of the landscape from. We might need you to mute your computer for a second, Adil. If you would. For a second, Adil. Okay. If you would. For a second, Adil. Okay, I'm going to skip the whole introductory part and just hand it straight over to Adil Najam, who's going to try and take us into a discussion of how we move forward. Okay.
Can you hear me now? Can someone give me an indication maybe on the message? I have turned my live stream off. Can people hear me there? Very good, excellent. Thank you very much for having me. It is a great pleasure to be with you, and this is an organization that I have the highest and utmost respect for, and I think the topic that you have chosen for today and talking about in the South Asian context is about as timely as it possibly can be. I really do wish that I was there myself with you, to be there live with you, and unfortunately that was not possible, but luckily while we still live in the world of borders, technology is one of the things that helps us break those borders. So very much in the theme, I'm very glad that technology has come to our assistance. I want to use my few minutes to essentially make 3 points. I'm usually a PowerPoint or a slide person, but luckily by not being there, I will resist the temptation to put those. And I'll make 3 big points. People before me, both the speakers, have made excellent points on both the larger end and the practical end of doing something about climate change. But I want to make 3 points which I think are central to the future of South Asia as it relates to climate change, and they are central to the work of MSF. They are central to the type of work that Doctors Without Borders does, and really central to the type of work that I think many people in this room do. So there are 3 points. The first of the points that I want to make is a very clear sense has to really emerge that we are now, as of today, as of May 27th, and before that, now living in the age of adaptation. Now, this may seem a trivial matter, but it's not, because frankly, I think the culprit here are people who work on climate change, and many of us, unfortunately, are still talking about as if the age of adaptation is something in the future. No, it is not. The age of adaptation is here. It is here today. It is happening now. What does that mean? What that means is that we have generally in the past talked about climate change as if it was something that would happen in the future, because we were living in the age of mitigation. And you all know the difference between mitigation and adaptation, but the central premise of the old age was that if we are wise enough, if we do something about climate change, we will somehow be able to avoid climate change or minimize climate change. That is no longer true. Because of the callousness of our species, because of the consumptive sins, not just of the rich countries, but of rich people, you and me. In developing countries, we are now living in a place where we have condemned not just future but current generations to live in the age of adaptation, which means that we will have to adapt to climate change. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that mitigation has evaporated. That doesn't mean mitigation is no longer important. Mitigation is very important, but simply because if we don't mitigate, the amount of adaptation needed will be even more. So yes, mitigation is important to reduce future impact, but now we are condemned to live with impact. Now, this has very serious implications that I will come to, but let me give you a very, very simple example with 2 facts before I go to my second point. And the first of this is that Mr. Donald Trump aside and other skeptics aside, this myth and this lie that we need to do more science for climate change because we need to know more about it before we act is absolute nonsense. Yes, we need to do more science to figure out how to do it better. Yes, we need to do more science how to find better solutions. Yes, we need to do more science because more science is always good. But no, we do not need to do more science simply to find out whether this is real or not. Here is my artifact, which I would have put up on the screen if I had the ability, but let me give you the numbers. Between 1991 and 2012, Note these numbers carefully. 1991 to 2012, 13,950 scholarly papers were written in peer-reviewed journals on climate change. 13,950. And of those 13,950 papers, only 24 in any way rejected the idea of climate change. Please tell me what other scientific concept has greater scientific unanimity than 13,950 papers, only 24 of which question the idea in any matter. So let us put that whole nonsense aside. The second important point is that tells us that we are living in the age of climate impact, we are living in the age of adaptation, is that if any one of you in this room is 32 years or younger, I can't see you, but I would still like you to raise your hands if you are 32 years or younger. If you are 32 years or younger, you have never in your life, never in your entire life, you have never ever witnessed a year that was cooler than average. And my instinct tells me you're not going to do that in a fairly long time. That is the extent of the reality of climate change. So this is not something in the future. This is something that is probably already impacting your work, whether you recognize it or not. Certainly it is impacting the work of Doctors Without Borders. So that is point one. Point two is, in the age of adaptation, in the age of climate impacts, the key metric of how we talk about climate change changes. In the old age of mitigation, which hasn't ended, that's still continuing, as I said, but now we are in this new formulation of adaptation being added to it. As long as we were talking only about mitigation, the way to talk about climate change was essentially to talk about carbon, because mitigation was really about carbon management. That is all it was about. How to manage carbon so that we can reduce future impacts. And that is all that was to it. As long as we were talking carbon, we were really only talking energy, because that was the primary culprit. Therefore, the entire focus of the climate debate was on carbon management. Therefore, the entire focus of the climate debate was on energy management. That is why you hear about Teslas, and you hear about cars, and you hear about renewable energy, and you hear about oil prices. All of that is important. However, the real focus of climate change in the age of adaptation has moved in the periodic table. It has moved from carbon to hydrogen and oxygen. And what I mean by that is that we are now living in a place and a time where we are and will be defining climate change mostly through the lens of water. Climate is no longer only carbon defined. Climate is going to be more and more defined by issues of water. And that is where I think it will hit your real lives as individuals and as professionals in the humanitarian and development fields. What do I mean? Think for a moment about the major impacts of climate change, particularly in South Asia, whether it is Pakistan, whether it is India, whether it is Nepal, whether it is Bhutan, whether it is Bangladesh, whether it is Sri Lanka, but anywhere in the world, whether it is Africa. Think about war-torn areas and think about where does climate change actually impact the lives of people. And I bet you that most of the answer you will find will no longer be about carbon, they will be about water. Think about this. So what is climate impact? What are the most likely climate impacts? They are about water melting, glaciers. They are about water disappearing, drought. They are about water rising, sea level rise. They are about water falling from the sky like no one's business, extreme events. So climate, where it meets real people and real impacts, really turns into issues of water. And that, I think, is where in your practice world, climate starts impacting how we live, what we do, how we do it. My country, Pakistan, for example, has now been for nearly 8 years in a constant state of floods and a constant state of drought and a constant state of heat waves. Now, no one is suggesting this is simply because of climate change. That's not how the fingerprint on the trigger works. What climate does is it exacerbates regular processes, but then creates a new normal. And I believe all across South Asia, there is a new normal that is water defined, that is sometimes water scarcity defined, that is very often water intensity defined, but that is everywhere exacerbated by the forces of climate change, and is everywhere showing itself in the lives of real people in the form of water. So that is the thing to take care of. Finally, and I hope I'm not overstepping my time here, finally my last point. And this is a sad point, but it is a real point. It is a point that MSF knows very well. The poor shall pay. The poor always do. That's unfair, but that's the world we live in. That's the world we need to change, but I don't think we're going to change it very soon. So let's at least realize the reality that here is an issue that is exacerbated by the equity issue is very, very important. It is exacerbated not just by rich country, poor country, but by rich people, poor people. By this great differential, not just in consumption, but in the footprint that you and I leave on planet Earth, which is far more dangerous and which has real impacts on the lives of the poorest people who do not leave that footprint and whose life is going to be impacted. Here is what I mean by it. Climate eventually is a development issue. And this is the real big problem with, I think, climate, how it is discussed, at least where I am right now in developed countries. Climate is still seen only as an environmental issue, as a planet and cute and cuddly issue. And we need to humanize the impacts of climate change, what it means to ordinary people, not just to polar bears. I've got nothing against polar bears, I love them. But we have to humanize the real pain and the real misery, and most importantly, the real insecurity that climate change causes. We have to talk about climate change in the language of insecurity. We have to talk about climate change in the language of vulnerability. We have to talk about climate change in the language of poverty, and we really have to talk about climate change as an issue of justice, of development justice around the world. Let me give you one example as I end, and I was warned that I should be very neutral in what I say, not bring politics. So let me say I'm not trying to bring politics. I'm a professor of international affairs, and that's my lens, but this is really not a political issue, so bear with me for just a minute. Some years ago, I wrote a book, along with colleagues, edited a book called Human Security, Environment and Development in South Asia. This was about all of South Asia. We had about 8 authors from all the countries in South Asia. And in one of my favorite numbers, harrowing numbers that comes out of it, is the following. And it is about water. And it is the following. At that point, it was 60 years of constant conflict between India and Pakistan. Again, I'm not making a political point here. 60 years of constant conflict between India and Pakistan. Not 1 war, 2 war, 3 wars, just up and down various levels of conflict. In the 60 years of conflict between India and Pakistan, total number of Indians killed by the Pakistan side in 60 years is less than, listen carefully, total number of Indians killed by the Pakistan side in 60 years is less than the number of children only who will die in New Delhi only, where you sit today, in 1 year only, because of dirty water only. The exact same number is true on the Pakistan side for Karachi. That, I think, is the reality of what climate change is about when it meets impact, when it's meet water. I'm not suggesting those children died because of climate change, but what I'm suggesting is that climate change exacerbates development and human insecurity issues like the one that I'm talking about. Why does this make my blood boil at 4 a.m. where I am now? Why am I getting excited at 4 a.m. in the morning talking to you about this? Here is why. If you are the mother of one of those children who die, whether they die in New Delhi or whether they die in Karachi because of dirty water, you do not care whether your child dies at the wrong end of a gun or a wrong end of a tap. Your child is no less dead in one case than the other. And yet, we as scholars, we as journalists, we as policymakers talk about one death as if it is a national calamity, and the other death as if it is a development statistic. Please, go and explain that to the mother of that child. Here is why I get excited about it. As a policy practitioner, as a policy scholar, as a professor, here is what I know. I have taught international affairs now for more than a quarter of a century. I have no idea what I can do about that gun. I know exactly what I can do about that tap. $8.80 is the cost of saving one life because of dirty water. And the cost is just about the same whether it is in New Delhi or in Karachi. And that, I think, is the real tragedy of climate change. That until we bring it from just being about carbon management, until we turn it from something about carbon management to something about human security, to human well-being, to development justice, we shall not be doing justice to the issue of climate change. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Professor Najam. I hope you can hear us. Maybe you can just nod if you can hear us. Can you hear us? Yes? You can okay. Can you nod if you can? Yes. Yeah, okay, please nod if you can hear us. Nod if you can. Yeah, okay. Yes. Yeah, okay, please nod if you can hear us. Okay. All right, so we will now move into question and answers. I'm not sure if you heard me earlier, but thank you very, very much for that extremely erudite but also quite moving talk and motivating talk. So can I invite Jyotsna back up on the panel and let's take a few questions, a few comments. If people would like to react to either of these talks or indeed to anything Professor Chelani said, the floor is open. Yes, please, first and second back there.
So I come from the health movement, so I have a very simple question to ask you. Do you think the health movement takes climate change very seriously?
Okay, we'll gather a few questions because the back and forth with the time lag becomes hard. Yes, please.
I think there have been studies about how climate change has exacerbated the war in Syria or Yemen or places like this. And are we going to see more of this in the future? And since we're talking about Asia, maybe some ideas about how what's happening with the climate can affect Asia from that point of view.
Okay, so the effects of climate change on, in a sense, traditional military security kinds of issues and internal unrest issues. I'd like to take a couple more because there's a time lag before we go back to our, in particular if we go back to Professor Najam. Who am I missing? Oh, please. There's a microphone coming to you.
Yeah, this question for Professor Najam. How would you place food security in the realm of climate change vis-a-vis water? Food security in the realm of climate change
please.
vis-a-vis water.
One over here, please.
So, I'm Ankur. My question is, I get that we understand what climate change does to us as human beings.
I get that we know enough what it does to us. Do we know enough what to do
to mitigate or adapt? I get that we know enough.
Okay. And I think that's probably enough for a first round of questions. Let me also just pose one to Jyotsna Puri, which is to say that you gave us very convincing evidence of the need for more careful and clear evaluation studies, understanding better what the how much we actually do know about how effective our interventions are. But in a sense, it's a similar question to the one for Professor Chelani. Is that the constraint on action, or do we already know enough to act reasonably well in at least a subset of cases? So maybe we'll just do this in reverse order. Turn to Professor Najam first and then come back to you, if that's okay, Joe. So over to you, Adil. If you could just text him as well.
Thank you very much. I did hear the questions. I've just muted it, so I hope you can hear me. If I can just get a signal that you can. I will not try to answer all the questions. They are extremely good, very good questions. They're excellent questions. And you realize that when someone says they're excellent questions, what they really mean is that that I have no idea how to answer them. That's why they are good questions. But here is a few thoughts. First, on this excellent question that was posed, does health take climate change seriously? I will leave that to you. You are the health professionals, but let me honestly say to you what I do know. I do not think that the climate change people take health seriously. I really don't, and this is my sort of this is my jihad, if you will, in climate change circles itself, trying to get climate people to take development seriously, because I think we have carbonized the issue too much, as I pointed out. This is going to be a major issue. One of the things I didn't talk about, but the neglect is major, because I think amongst the biggest things that will hit the climate community is disease vectors. And we are seeing this with epidemics, whether it is dengue and so on and so forth. Again, I'm not suggesting the link between climate and these is direct, but I think the scientific evidence is that that is probably one of the biggest things that will hit beyond natural disaster, that will make those dots connect. And I don't think the climate community is ready for it. That's my thought. The second point is about wars, and you are exactly right. There's been excellent research, certainly in Rwanda, less so in Syria, which suggests that particularly in Africa, some of the recent conflicts that we have seen have had climatic causality. That doesn't mean the causality is linear. What that means is that in many of these situations, there is a natural resource push that comes before the conflict. And what you start seeing is that, you know, water disappears in my area, I start moving into your territory, you are nice to me and you say, sure, come and take a drink. And then I just stay there, and very soon you find that you and I have ages, centuries of dispute. So climate becomes a major exacerbating factor in conflict. And we have seen this in Africa, within our region. I think we have seen it more around the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. We all talk about extremism and we all talk about the religious aspect, but there's a natural resource aspect. And you can look at the spatial maps of what has happened to vegetation in these nomadic tribes of nomadic people with very little vegetation in the first place. When you have large movements of people, of refugees, that puts a pressure on natural resources. And that natural resource pressure then translates into conflict. A final thought on that about food security and water wars. Water wars wasn't mentioned, but when we talk certainly India, Pakistan, that's one of the thoughts that comes. First, on food security, you're exactly right. Food, once you talk water, you're really talking food, particularly in South Asia. You know, in some ways, I think of what is food except nature's way of packaging water. right? Water is the most important ingredient in what we call food in our region. Nature just takes water, packages it as wheat sometimes, and as fruit other times, and so on and so forth, so that we can transport it. But water and food are very, very critically related. My own research in Pakistan suggests both the good and the bad news. The bad news is that we did a study of climate impact on wheat and rice in southern Punjab and upper Sindh in Pakistan. And what we found was that with current climatic trends, the productivity could go down by up to 15%, 1.5. That is huge for a country whose economics is really dependent on these crops. However, on the other side, we found that even with the very little good adaptation inputs, that yield could come up. Not just stay there, but come up by up to 12% from what it is now. So there is a benefit, just like there is a benefit in the energy transition, there could be a benefit in better agricultural and food practices because of adaptation. Water wars, and last point on this, and sorry for taking time, the same book that I had mentioned. In that book, we had a final chapter which we all co-wrote, and we had 5 conclusions about South Asia and human security. Only one of them was unanimous. These are South Asians, we never agree, we are argumentative. So of the 5, only one was unanimous. You wouldn't guess what that is, but let me tell you. The unanimous conclusion was India and Pakistan will not go to war over water. Why? Because we've got so many other things to fight about first. But also why? Because water is too important. That doesn't mean water doesn't become conflict. It becomes conflict very often at local levels. It becomes conflict at the village level in both India and Pakistan, wherever water is. So yes, water is a source of conflict, but historically it has not been a source of national war. My colleague Aaron Wolf from the University of Colorado suggests that the last real water war was pre-biblical. But the reason for that is that water is so important to people, that they have to find some way to coexist over it. Even in Israel-Palestine, the only agreement that continues to work is the one about groundwater.
Great, thank you so much, Adil, and thank you for being up at 4 o'clock and being animated at 4 o'clock. Jyotsna, can I turn it over to you to add your thoughts?
Thanks, Navroz. So, couple of points here. So people talked about diversity, whether there was going to be greater extinction as a consequence of, am I paraphrasing or have I gotten it completely wrong? So, I see, yes, okay. So I'm going to take off from there because it also ties in very nicely with Navroz's question to me. So let's step back a little bit. I think the evidence now is pretty much established that yes, anthropogenic climate change is occurring. Now, Michael Mann, who's an expert in this space, was at the US Senate very recently, and he's got this wonderful book, if you all want to look at it, which is called Climate Madness, where he's collaborated also with a New Yorker cartoonist, where he said that 97% of the scientists in the world agree that there is anthropogenic climate change. Despite the President of the United States, I think we can all agree on that. The reason that we are still at a space of inaction is because we are still trying to figure out what to do. And I think I'm much more sanguine than a lot of people in this space because I think there is a light at the end of this tunnel. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky have done a lot of work in what is now called behavioral science or behavioral economics. And what it says is that they've also, Daniel Kahneman is I think one of the very few Nobel Prize winners in economics, although his actual training is in psychology. And what they find is that people react to many other things other than just evidence and knowledge. Evidence is knowledge, and knowledge is one thing. But because of inertia, because people don't want to change their behavior, etc., you need other nudges. And there is now an entire school of thought that is basically building on this. You have what is called the Behavioral Insights team, which was started by David Cameron in the UK, which has now experimented with very, very easy, simple things so that you can change behavior. For example, sending people letters which say, oh, you haven't paid your taxes. Guess what? People who get these letters usually pay their taxes on time. It changed tax-paying behavior from people who had been defaulting repeatedly, dramatically, just because people don't want to look bad. So I think there is now a lot of research being done in what can induce better and more responsible action. We have to spend time and money doing it.
Great. Thank you very much, Jyotsna. And thank you again, Adil, for being up, for being very cogent, for being very passionate, and and motivating us really in this conversation. My job is just now to conclude the session, but just before I do that, a personal observation perhaps for a minute or so. I think some of the messages we've heard today are really important, not just because they motivate us, they make it clear how important these conversations are, but the reframing of climate change as a development issue, using the language of insecurity, fundamentally opens up the conversation to audiences like this. It brings in extremely high quality and motivated organizations like MSF into the conversation in a useful way. It broadens the discussion to everybody's lifestyle. So for example, Brahmacharani's point about consumption, this is something that we can actually do. It changes the conversation from feeling like this is an abstract, diffuse issue that is only negotiated among negotiators periodically in cities like Bonn and Geneva, to issues that we can actually engage with and confront in our daily life. And I think this reframing, so how do we know about this issue? Of course, we do need better evidence. We need to push the boundaries of knowledge, but we can also start acting based on this reframing of the question into something that actually we can engage with in the context of the sorts of work that MSF and other organizations do, framed as human development, as security, and basically opening up a much larger canvas for conversation. So I think this conversation has been very useful in doing that, and I hope with me you will take that larger message away from the conversation. And thank you once again to our speakers and to MSF for organizing this event.
So we're now going to move into a break. Maybe just a couple of points. You might like to know that we have trended on Twitter. Don't ask me to explain that. I think the IT people can explain it to you, but as I understand it, the cool people online have taken notice. But with the point that actually this is a discussion. Yes, there's research, there's evidence, but I hope you'll take that as a launching pad for discussions, because it's going to come back to action. What are we going to do about it? And for something like climate change and for some of the topics that we discussed, is there something here for MSF that we should be challenging to our organization to be doing from today that we can do in the short term, because we're all more concerned about the short term. So what can MSF do in the short term? That's my challenge to you in the break. Please be back by 3:15, so you've got 25 minutes. And for the next session, the speakers and the chair, can you come down just before you go to your break? Thank you very much.